Chapter 8, Part 2 of The Life of Harriet Beecher Stowe, compiled from her letters and journals by her son Charles Edward Stowe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8, First Trip to Europe, 1853, Part 2. A similar statement made by Clark and Company in October 1852 reveals the following facts. It says, quote, "An early copy was sent from America the latter end of April to Mr. Bogue, the publisher, and was offered by him to Mr. Gilpin, late of Bishopgate Street. Being declined by Mr. Gilpin, Mr. Bogue offered it to Mr. Henry Visitelli, and by the latter gentleman it was eventually purchased for us. Before printing it, however, as there was one night allowed for decision, one volume was taken home to be read by Mr. Visitelli, and the other by Mr. Salisbury, the printer, of Bouvier Street. The report of the latter gentleman the following morning, to quote his own words, was, 'I sat up till 4 in the morning reading the book, and the interest I felt was expressed one moment by laughter, another by tears. Thinking it might be weakness and not the power of the author that affected me, I resolved to try the effect upon my wife, a rather strong-minded woman. I accordingly woke her and read a few chapters to her. Finding that the interest in the story kept her awake, and that she too laughed and cried, I settled in my mind that it was a book that ought to, and might with safety, be printed." End quote. Mr. Visitelli's opinion coincided with that of Mr. Salisbury, and to the latter gentleman it was confided to be brought out immediately. The week following, the book was produced, and one edition of 7,000 copies worked off. It made no stir until the middle of June, although we advertised it very extensively. From June it began to make its way, and it sold at a rate of 1,000 per week during July. In August the demand became very great, and went on increasing to the 20th, by which time it was perfectly overwhelming. We have now about 400 people employed in getting out the book, and 17 printing machines, besides hand presses. Already about 150,000 copies of the book are in the hands of the people, and still the returns of sales show no decline." End quote. The story was dramatized in the United States in August 1852 without the consent or knowledge of the author, who had neglected to reserve her rights for this purpose. In September of the same year we find it announced as the attraction at 2 London theaters, namely the Royal Victoria and the Great National Standard. In 1853 Professor Stowe writes, "The drama of Uncle Tom has been going on in the National Theatre of New York all summer with most unparalleled success. Everybody goes night after night, and nothing can stop it. The enthusiasm beats that of the run in the Boston Museum out and out. The Tribune is full of it. The Observer, the Journal of Commerce, and all that sort of fellows are astonished and nonplussed. They do not know what to say or do about it." End quote. While the English editions of the story were rapidly multiplying, and being issued with illustrations by Cruikshank, introductions by Elihu Burritt, Lord Carlisle, etc., it was also making its way over the continent. For the authorized French edition, translated by Madame Belloc, and published by Charpentier of Paris, Mrs. Stowe wrote the following preface to the European edition, quote, "In authorizing the circulation of this work on the continent of Europe, the author has only this apology, that the love of man is higher than the love of country. The great mystery which all Christian nations hold in common, the union of God with man through the humanity of Jesus Christ, invests human existence with an awful sacredness, and in the eye of the true believer in Jesus, he who tramples on the rights of his meanest fellow man is not only inhuman but sacrilegious. And the worst form of this sacrilege is the institution of slavery. It has been said that the representations of this book are exaggerations, and oh, would that this were true! Would that this book were indeed a fiction, and not a closed mosaic of facts! But that it is not a fiction, the proof lies bleeding in thousands of hearts. They have been attested by surrounding voices from almost every slave state, and from slave owners themselves. Since so it must be, Thanks be to God that this mighty cry, this wail of an unutterable anguish, has at last been heard. It has been said, and not in utter despair, but in solemn hope and assurance, that we may regard the struggle that now convulses America, the outcry of the demon of slavery, which has heard the voice of Jesus of Nazareth, and is rending and convulsing the noble nation from which at last it must depart. It cannot be that so monstrous a solecism can long exist in the bosom of a nation which in all respects is the best exponent of the great principle of universal brotherhood. In America, the Frenchman, the German, the Italian, the Swede, and the Irish all mingle on terms of equal right. All nations there display their characteristic excellences and are admitted by her liberal laws to equal privileges. Everything is tending to liberalize, humanize, and elevate. And for that very reason it is that the contest with slavery there grows every year more terrible. The stream of human progress, widening, deepening, strengthening from the confluent forces of all nations, meets this barrier, behind which is concentrated all the ignorance, cruelty, and oppression of the Dark Ages. And it roars and foams and shakes the barrier, and anon it must bear it down. In its commencement, slavery overspread every state in the Union. The progress of society has now emancipated the North from its yoke. In Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, and Maryland at different times, strong movements have been made for emancipation, movements enforced by a compassion of the progressive march of the adjoining free states with the poverty and sterility and ignorance produced by a system which in a few years wastes and exhausts all the resources of the soil without the power of renewal. The time cannot be distant when these states will emancipate for self-preservation, and if no new slave territory be added, the increase of slave population in the remainder will enforce measures of emancipation. Here, then, is the point of the battle. Unless more slave territory is gained, slavery dies. If it is gained, it lives. Around this point, political parties fight and maneuver, and every year the battle wages hotter. The internal struggles of no other nation in the world are so interesting to Europeans as those of America, for America is fast filling up from Europe, and every European has almost immediately his vote in her councils. If, therefore, the oppressed of other nations desire to find in America an asylum of permanent freedom, let them come prepared, heart and hand, and vote against the institution of slavery, for they who enslave man cannot themselves remain free. True are the great words of Kossuth, "No nation can remain free with whom freedom is a privilege and not a principle." This preface was more or less widely copied in the 20 translations of the book that quickly followed its first appearance. These, arranged in the alphabetical order of their languages, are as follows: Armenian, Bohemian, Danish, Dutch, Finnish, Flemish, French, German, Hungarian, Illyrian, Italian, Polish, Portuguese, Romaniac or modern Greek, Russian, Serbian, Spanish, Wallachian, and Welsh. In Germany, it received the following flattering notice from one of the leading literary journals. The abolitionists in the United States should vote the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin a civic crown, for a more powerful ally than Mrs. Harriet Beecher Stowe and her romance they could not have. We confess that in the whole modern romance literature of Germany, England, and France, we know of no novel to be called equal to this. In comparison with its glowing eloquence that never fails of its purpose, its wonderful truth to nature, the largeness of its ideas, and the artistic faultlessness of the machinery in the book, George Sand, with her Spiridion and Claudie, appears to us untrue and artificial. Dickens, with his but too faithful pictures of the popular life of London, petty, Bulwer, hectic and self-conscious. It is like a sign of warning from the New World to the Old. Madame George Sand reviewed the book and spoke of Mrs. Stowe herself in words at once appreciative and discriminating. Quote, Mrs. Stowe is all instinct. It is the very reason she appears to some not to have talent. Has she not talent? What is talent? Nothing, doubtless, compared to genius. But has she genius? She has genius as humanity feels the need of genius, the genius of goodness, not that of the man of letters, but that of the saint. End quote. Charles Sumner wrote from the Senate chamber at Washington to Professor Stowe, quote, all that I hear and read bears testimony to the good Mrs. Stowe has done. The article of George Sand is a most remarkable tribute, such as was hardly ever offered by such a genius to any living mortal. Should Mrs. Stowe conclude to visit Europe, she will have a triumph. End quote. From Eversley Parsonage, Charles Kingsley wrote to Mrs. Stowe, 1,000 thanks for your delightful letter. As for your progress and ovation here in England, I have no fear for you. You will be flattered and worshipped. You deserve it, and you must bear it. I am sure that you have seen and suffered too much and too long to be injured by the foolish yet honest and heartfelt lionizing which you must go through. I have many a story to tell you when we meet about the effects of this great book upon the most unexpected people. Yours ever faithfully, C. Kingsley. March 28, 1853, Professor Stowe sent the following communication to the Committee of Examination of the Theological Seminary at Andover. Quote, I shall not be present at the examinations this term. I think it proper to make you a statement of the reasons of my absence. During the last winter I have not enjoyed my usual health. Mrs. Stowe also became sick and very much exhausted. At this time we had the offer of a voyage to Great Britain and back free of expense. End quote. This offer, coming as it did from the friends of the cause of emancipation in the United Kingdom, was gladly accepted by Mr. and Mrs. Stowe, and they sailed immediately. The preceding month, Mrs. Stowe had received a letter from Mrs. Follen in London, asking for information with regard to herself, her family, and the circumstances of her writing Uncle Tom's Cabin. In reply, Mrs. Stowe sent the following very characteristic letter, which may be safely given at the risk of some repetition. Quote, Andover, February 16, 1853. My dear Madam, I hasten to reply to your letter, to me the more interesting that I have long been acquainted with you, and during all the nursery part of my life made daily use of your poems for children. I used to think sometimes in those days that I would write to you and tell you how much I was obliged to you for the pleasure which they gave us all. So you want to know something about what sort of woman I am? Well, if this is any object, you shall have statistics free of charge. To begin, then, I am a little bit of a woman, somewhat more than 40, about as thin and dry as a pinch of snuff, never very much to look at in my best days, and looking like a used-up article now. I was married when I was 25 years old to a man rich in Greek and Hebrew, Latin and Arabic, and, alas, rich in nothing else. When I went to housekeeping, my entire stock of china for parlor and kitchen was bought for $11. That lasted very well for 2 years, till my brother was married and brought his bride to visit me. I then found, on review, that I had neither plates nor teacups to set a table for my father's family. Wherefore I thought it best to reinforce the establishment by getting me a tea-set that cost $10 more, and this, I believe, formed my whole stock in trade for some years. But then I was abundantly enriched with wealth of another sort. I had 2 little curly-headed twin daughters to begin with, and my stock in this line has gradually increased, till I have been the mother of 7 children, the most beautiful and most loved of whom lies buried near my Cincinnati residence. It was at his dying bed and at his grave that I learned what a poor slave mother may feel when her child is torn away from her. In those depths of sorrow, which seemed to me immeasurable, it was my only prayer to God that such anguish might not be suffered in vain. There were circumstances about his death of such peculiar bitterness, of what seemed almost cruel suffering, that I felt that I could never be consoled for it, unless this crushing of my own heart might enable me to work out some great good to others. I allude to this here because I have often felt that much that is in the book, Uncle Tom, had its root in the awful scenes and bitter sorrows of that summer. It has left now, I trust, no trace on my mind, except a deep compassion for the sorrowful, especially for mothers who are separated from their children. During long years of struggling with poverty and sickness and a hot, debilitating climate, my children grew up around me. The nursery and the kitchen were my principal fields of labor. Some of my friends, pitying my trials, copied and sent a number of little sketches from my pen to certain liberally paying annuals with my name. With the first money that I earned in this way, I bought a feather bed. For as I had married into poverty and without a dowry, and as my husband had only a large library of books and a great deal of learning, the bed and pillows were thought the most profitable investment. After this, I thought that I had discovered the philosopher's stone. So, when a new carpet or mattress was going to be needed, or when, at the close of the year, it began to be evident that my family accounts, like poor Dora's, wouldn't add up, then I used to say to my faithful friend and factotum Anna, who shared all my joys and sorrows, "Now, if you will keep the babies and attend to the things in the house for one day, I'll write a piece, and then we shall be out of the scrape." So I became an author, very modest at first, I do assure you, and remonstrating very seriously with the friends who had thought it best to put my name to the pieces by way of getting up a reputation. And if you ever see a woodcut of me, with an immoderately long nose, on the cover of all the U.S. almanacs, I wish you to take notice that I have been forced into it, contrary to my natural modesty, by the imperative solicitations of my dear 5,000 friends and the public generally. One thing I must say with regard to my life at the West, which you will understand better than many English women could. I lived 2 miles from the city of Cincinnati, in the country, and domestic service, not always, to be found in the city, is next to an impossibility to obtain in the country, even by those who are willing to give the highest wages. So what was to be expected for poor me, who had very little of this world's goods to offer? Had it not been for my inseparable friend Anna, a noble-hearted English girl, who landed on our shores in destitution and sorrow, and clave to me as Ruth to Naomi, I had never lived through all the trials which this uncertainty and want of domestic service imposed on both. You may imagine, therefore, how glad I was when, our seminary properly being divided out into small lots which were to be rented at a low price, a number of poor families settled in our vicinity, from whom we could occasionally obtain domestic service. About a dozen families of liberated slaves were among the number, and they became my favorite resort in cases of emergency. If anybody wishes to have a black face look handsome, let them be left, as I have been, in feeble health, in oppressive hot weather, with a sick baby in arms, and 2 or 3 other little ones in the nursery, and not a servant in the whole house to do a single thing. Then, if they could see my good old Aunt Frankie coming, with her honest, buff, black face, her long, strong arms, her chest as big and stout as a barrel, and her hilarious, hearty laugh, perfectly delighted to take one's washing and do it at a fair price, they would appreciate the beauty of black people. My cook, poor Eliza Buck, how she would stare to think of her name going to England, was a regular epitome of slave life in herself. Fat, gentle, easy, loving and lovable, always calling my very modest house and dooryard the place, as if it had been a plantation with 700 hands on it. She had lived through the whole sad story of a Virginia-raised slave's life. In her youth she must have been a very handsome mulatto girl. Her voice was sweet, and her manners refined and agreeable. She was raised in a good family as a nurse and a seamstress. When the family became embarrassed, she was suddenly sold onto a plantation in Louisiana. She has often told me how, without any warning, she was suddenly forced into a carriage and saw her little mistress screaming and stretching her arms from the window towards her as she was driven away. She has told me of scenes on the Louisiana plantation, and she has often been out at night by stealth ministering to poor slaves who had been mangled and lacerated by the lash. Hence she was sold into Kentucky, and her last master was the father of all her children. On this point she even maintained a delicacy and reserve that always appeared to me remarkable. She always called him her husband, and it was not till after she had lived with me some years that I discovered the real nature of the connection. I shall never forget how sorry I felt for her, nor my feelings at her humble apology. You know, Miss Stowe, slave women cannot help themselves. She had 2 very pretty quadroon daughters, with her beautiful hair and eyes, interesting children, whom I had instructed in the family school with my children. Time would fail to tell you all that I learned incidentally of the slave system, in the history of various slaves who came into my family, and of the Underground Railroad, which, I may say, ran through our house. But the letter is already too long. You ask with regard to the remuneration which I have received for my work here in America. Having been poor all my life, and expecting to be poor the rest of it, the idea of making money by a book which I wrote, just because I could not help it, never occurred to me. It was therefore an agreeable surprise to receive $10,000 as the first fruits of 3 months' sales. I presume as much more is now due. Mr. Bosworth in England, the firm of Clark and Company, and Mr. Bentley have all offered me an interest in the sales of their editions in London. I am very glad of it, both on account of the value of what they offer, and the value of the example they set in this matter, wherein I think that justice has been too little regarded. I have been invited to visit Scotland, and shall probably spend the summer there and in England. I have very much at heart a design to erect in some of the northern states a normal school for the education of colored teachers in the United States and in Canada. I have very much wished that some permanent memorial of good to the colored race might be created out of the proceeds of a work which promises to have so unprecedented a sale. My own share of the profits will be less than that of the publishers, either English or American, but I am willing to give largely for this purpose, and I have no doubt that the publishers, both American and English, will unite with me, for nothing tends more immediately to the emancipation of the slave than the education and elevation of the free. I am now writing a work which will contain, perhaps, an equal amount of matter with Uncle Tom's Cabin. It will contain all the facts and documents on which that story was founded, and an immense body of facts, reports of trials, legal documents, and testimony of people now living South, which will more than confirm every statement in Uncle Tom's Cabin. I must confess that till I began the examination of facts, in order to write this book, much as I thought I knew before, I had not begun to measure the depth of the abyss. The law records of courts and judicial proceedings are so incredible as to fill me with amazement whenever I think of them. It seems to me that the book cannot but be felt, and, coming upon the sensibility awaked by the other, do something. I suffer exquisitely in writing these things. It may be truly said that I write with my heart's blood. Many times in writing Uncle Tom's Cabin, I thought my health would fail utterly, but I prayed earnestly that God would help me till I got through, and still I am pressed beyond measure and above strength. This horror, this nightmare abomination, can it be in my country? It lies like lead on my heart. It shadows my life with sorrow. The more so that I feel as for my own brothers for the South, and am pained by every horror I am obliged to write, as one who is forced by some awful oath to disclose in court some family disgrace. Many times I have thought that I must die, and yet I pray God that I may live to see something done. I shall in all probability be in London in May. Shall I see you? It seems to me so odd and dreamlike that so many persons desire to see me, and now I cannot help thinking that they will think, when they do, that God hath chosen the weak things of this world. If I live till spring, I shall hope to see Shakespeare's grave, and Milton's mulberry tree, and the good land of my fathers, old, old England. May that day come. Yours affectionately, H.B. Stowe. End of Chapter 8. Read for you by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana.